Daniel stood in the hallway of his quiet home, listening to the final echo of a door slamming, the sound of a life he once recognized slipping away. Papers were scattered across the floor, bills he could no longer ignore. Consequences he never imagined would grow from one choice he thought was harmless. The late afternoon light cut through the blinds, sharp and cold, landing on the empty chair where his peace used to sit. He pressed his hands against his face, trying to steady his breathing, but the silence only grew heavier. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not because of that decision, not because of something so small. Or so he thought. What he didn't know was that the unraveling he feared was only the surface of a deeper shift already taking shape beneath everything he was losing. Outside, a car engine started, someone leaving, someone tired of waiting for him to change. Daniel's heart sank. This moment, this breaking, felt like the final blow. But what he couldn't see was that this would soon become the turning point he would remember for the rest of his life. Somewhere in the middle of the mess on the floor lay the first clue, the first quiet nudge, the beginning of a lesson God had been trying to place in his path long before Daniel ever realized he needed it. And the truth hidden inside that lesson would not just confront him, it would transform him. He just didn't know it yet. Before everything collapsed, Daniel's life moved with a steady rhythm, predictable, structured, almost comfortable. He worked at a small accounting firm in the center of town, the kind of place where everyone knew who kept the coffee machine alive and who always forgot their lunch in the fridge. Daniel wasn't the loudest or the brightest presence there, but he was reliable. People trusted him, and until recently, that trust felt like enough. He lived in a modest house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a place where children rode bikes until sunset and neighbors waved even when they barely knew each other's names. On most evenings, Daniel would return home, drop his keys in the same bowl, and settle into the same chair, the one now standing empty in the middle of his unraveling, but back then it felt like an anchor. His closest friend, Thomas, had known him since childhood. Thomas was the steady voice in Daniel's life, the one who could read his silences better than his words. They often met at a small diner near the old train tracks, drinking coffee that tasted slightly burnt, but somehow comforting. Daniel admired how Thomas seemed to carry peace with him wherever he went, a quiet certainty, a calm faith. Sometimes, Daniel wondered what it would be like to feel that grounded. One evening, months before Daniel's decision sent everything spinning, he and Thomas sat in their usual booth. The sun was lowering behind the windows, painting the sky in soft gold. Thomas spoke about gratitude, not in a grand way, but with the simplicity Daniel envied. "Even when life feels ordinary," Thomas said, stirring his coffee, "I thank God for the small things. Peace doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet, steady like breath." Daniel nodded, pretending to understand, though his heart felt restless. Still, he offered a small whisper under his breath, his first act of worship in a long time. "God, thank you for today, even if I don't fully know what to do with it." He didn't think much of it, but something softened in him, just for a moment. But beneath the surface of his steady life, a subtle discomfort had been rising, a desire for more, a longing to prove something, not to others, but to himself. So when an opportunity came along, one that seemed harmless, simple, and even clever, he took it without hesitation. What Daniel didn't realize was that this choice, this one small decision, carried threads he couldn't yet see, threads that would soon tug at everything around him. As the months passed, his world began to shift. Little things first. A tense conversation with his manager. A strange distance in his relationships. Unexpected pressure building in places he once felt secure. Daniel brushed these off, convincing himself everything would settle on its own. But the quiet disturbances were only the beginning. One night, as he sat alone in his living room, Daniel felt something tug at him from within. An unspoken awareness, a gentle nudge he didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was more like a whisper urging him to pay attention. He ignored it. If he had listened that night, if he had paused long enough to sense God's warning, maybe the unraveling would have felt different. But Daniel was convinced he knew what he was doing. What he didn't know was that the consequences were already moving toward him, steady and unavoidable, and that God's hand, quiet and patient, was already preparing the lesson that would shape the rest of his life. The unraveling didn't arrive with a dramatic crash. It crept in quietly, then struck all at once. It began on a Thursday morning at the office, when Daniel was called into a meeting he didn't know was happening. The room felt colder than usual, the blinds half open, the light falling across the conference table like a silent accusation. His manager, Mr. Harris, slid a folder toward him. Inside were numbers Daniel recognized, adjustments he had made. Small shifts he once told himself were harmless shortcuts, nothing illegal, nothing disastrous. At least that's what he believed when he first did it. But now, those harmless choices were printed in bold, highlighted, and waiting for an explanation. "Daniel," Mr. Harris said, voice steady but disappointed, "why would you do this?" Everyone else in the room avoided his eyes. The silence thickened, a public judgment disguised as corporate procedure. Daniel felt heat rise in his chest. He tried to explain, but the words tangled. The harder he fought to justify himself, the clearer it became. No one was buying it. He saw the trust in the faces around him fade, piece by piece. By the end of the meeting, Daniel wasn't just reprimanded. He was suspended pending review. The news traveled fast. Co-workers whispered in hallways he now felt too ashamed to walk through. A few tried to offer sympathetic looks, but most simply stepped aside as he passed, the weight of their unspoken conclusions hanging behind him. He walked out of the building with his belongings in a box, the midday sun far too bright for what he felt inside. A small group of employees stood near the steps, talking in low voices. When one noticed him, the conversation halted. Eyes shifted. Someone shook their head. Someone else whispered his name. Daniel kept walking, pretending not to notice, but each step felt heavier than the last. He hadn't just lost his job, he had lost the image people once had of him. That evening, he went to the diner, hoping for refuge in routine. But even there, the atmosphere felt different. Two men at the counter lowered their voices as he entered. The waitress forced a polite smile, the kind given to someone whose story has already circulated through town. Daniel sat alone at his usual booth. The coffee tasted bitter, and for once, not even the familiar hum of the diner soothed him. He felt exposed, like every eye recognized his failure. What he didn't know was that this was not the worst moment. Not yet. Something deeper, something more personal was still coming. When he arrived home, he found Thomas waiting on the porch. His expression wasn't judgmental. It was heavy with concern. But Daniel, raw from humiliation, misread it. He snapped, raising his voice, insisting he didn't need advice or pity. Thomas remained calm, but his quiet steadiness only made Daniel feel more ashamed. "Daniel," Thomas said softly, "this isn't the end. Just talk to me." But Daniel couldn't. Not then, not while the pieces of his life were still crashing around him. He went inside and closed the door, not slamming it keishun, but shutting it with the kind of finality that comes from fear disguised as pride. He sank to the floor, head in his hands, the echo of his outburst lingering in the hallway. She thought this was the worst, but it wasn't. Daniel would soon learn that what came next would reach deeper than professional reputation or public opinion. It would touch the core of who he believed himself to be. The next morning, the world felt strangely quiet. Daniel woke before sunrise, not because he wanted to, but because sleep no longer seemed to know how to stay with him. He wandered through his house like a guest in someone else's life, each room echoing with reminders of decisions he now wished he could undo. As he stepped onto the back porch, the sky was still a deep blue, slowly brightening at the edges. The cool air settled around him, grounding him in a way he hadn't felt in days. It was there, in the stillness, that he heard footsteps approaching. When he turned, he saw Thomas walking through the gate. Thomas didn't look angry. He didn't look disappointed. He looked present, and that alone loosened something tight inside Daniel. "Mind if I sit?" Thomas asked. Daniel nodded, too tired to pretend. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the world awaken. Birds began their morning chorus. Leaves shifted in the breeze, and for a brief moment, Daniel felt a flicker of peace, the kind he had run from without realizing it. Finally, Thomas spoke. "Daniel, you've been carrying this alone, and you weren't meant to." Daniel looked down at his hands, frustration stirring. "I made one choice, one mistake, and everything fell apart." Thomas shook his head gently. "This isn't about a mistake. It's about what God is trying to show you through it." Daniel exhaled, long and heavy. "I don't know what he could possibly teach me through this. Maybe," Thomas said, "that your value was never tied to being perfect, but to being willing. Willing to learn, willing to change, willing to listen." His words settled into Daniel's chest, steady and honest. Something in him cracked open, releasing a quiet ache he hadn't allowed himself to feel. A moment passed. Then Daniel whispered a prayer, small, humble, trembling at the edges. "Lord, guide me. Help me see what you're trying to show me. I don't understand, but I want to learn." The prayer was simple, but it softened the fog around his heart. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "This isn't the end of your story. It might actually be the beginning." Daniel didn't fully believe it yet, but the stillness around him seemed to breathe with possibility. Something in the air shifted, a gentle nudge that felt almost like reassurance. What Daniel didn't know was that this early morning conversation was preparing him for the turn he didn't yet see. A door was about to open, one that would change the trajectory of everything that felt lost. Before Daniel could take his next step, the weight of everything he had been hiding finally settled in his chest. And maybe you've felt that too. That moment when life forces you to stop, breathe, and look at the truth you've avoided. His story is just beginning to turn, and what comes next might speak directly to someone watching. If this journey is touching you in any way, let me know where you're watching from, your city and country. And if you want more stories that lift your faith and your heart, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with us. Now, Daniel's turning point is about to arrive. What he doesn't know is that the first sign of God's mercy is already on its way. 2 days after that quiet morning on the porch, Daniel found himself walking through town with no real destination. He wasn't looking for answers, he didn't even know where to start, but something inside him nudged him to move, to not stay trapped within the four walls that held so much regret. He passed familiar streets, shops he used to visit without thinking, people who once greeted him with warmth before the rumors spread. Some still looked away, others whispered, yet for the first time, Daniel didn't let their reactions stop him. Something Thomas had said kept echoing in his mind, willing to listen. As he crossed the street near the old train station, he noticed a community center he had never paid much attention to. A hand-painted sign stood outside, "Help Needed," after-school program. He paused, unsure why it pulled him in. This wasn't his world. He didn't work with kids. He barely felt steady enough to handle his own life. But the tug wouldn't leave. Before he could talk himself out of it, Daniel stepped inside. The building buzzed with the sound of children laughing, sneakers squeaking on the floor, conversations overlapping. A woman with warm eyes and a gentle, almost motherly presence approached him. "Can I help you?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "I saw the sign. I don't know if you need volunteers, but—" Her smile widened. "We always need help. I'm Grace." Her name felt fitting, almost intentional. She introduced him to the room, small groups of kids doing homework, building crafts, practicing basic math. Nothing complicated, nothing he couldn't handle. And for the first time in weeks, Daniel felt something lift. He helped a boy named Jason with simple arithmetic. At first, the child was frustrated, slamming his pencil, insisting he couldn't do it. But Daniel stayed patient, guiding him step by step. And then it happened. Jason's face lit up when he solved the problem correctly. "You did that," Daniel said quietly. Jason shook his head. "No, you stayed. Most people don't." The words hit deeper than they should have. As the afternoon unfolded, Daniel felt a strange warmth in his chest, one he hadn't felt since before everything fell apart. A tiny, unexpected blessing, a moment of being useful again, not because of status or reputation, but simply because he showed up. When the program ended, Grace approached him again. "You were good with them," she said. "If you ever want to come back, you're welcome." Daniel nodded, surprised at how much those words meant. Walking home, he looked up at the sky, soft clouds drifting across a pale sunset. For the first time since his suspension, he whispered a quiet moment of worship. "God, thank you for this small mercy. I didn't expect it, but I needed it." Something inside him settled, not fixed, not fully healed, but steadied. What Daniel didn't know was that this blessing was only the beginning. A far greater challenge, one that would test everything he had begun to learn, was already approaching, closer than he realized. And it wouldn't be gentle. For a few days, the after-school program became a quiet refuge for Daniel, a place where the noise of his mistakes seemed softer and the weight on his chest lighter. He began to show up regularly, helping wherever Grace needed him. The children welcomed him with uncomplicated trust, something he didn't believe he deserved but gratefully received. But just when he began to find steady ground again, the storm he never saw coming gathered above him. It started with an email from his company's HR department. "Final review complete. Mandatory meeting." Daniel's stomach tightened. He knew what this meant, and still, a small part of him hoped for mercy. The meeting was scheduled for Friday morning, the same day the community center was hosting a special event for the kids. Grace had asked him to help present awards for the small academic challenges they had completed. Jason, especially, had been excited, telling Daniel every day, "Don't forget, you have to come." But the meeting was unavoidable. On Friday, Daniel arrived at the corporate office. The hallways felt colder than the last time he walked them. People glanced at him briefly, then looked away, as though the air around him carried a quiet warning. Failure. Inside the conference room, the verdict came quickly. His suspension became termination. The adjustments he had made, once so small in his own eyes, were classified as misconduct. Not criminal, but serious enough to stain his reputation. A formal note would be placed in his record. He would not be rehired. Severance was denied. Daniel sat still, hearing the words but feeling them more than understanding them. The room pulsed. His heartbeat thudded in his ears. The ground beneath him, which had felt steady these last few days, shifted violently. He left the building with no box this time. There was nothing left to collect. Outside, rain began to fall, drenching the sidewalk. He walked without knowing where he was going, the humiliation settling like a stone in his chest. Everything he had tried to rebuild, his dignity, his direction, the faint spark of hope, felt like it was slipping again. He checked the time. He was late for the community event. He ran, breath heavy, shoes slapping against the wet pavement. By the time he reached the center, his clothes were soaked. He rushed inside, but the awards ceremony had already ended. Chairs were being stacked, tables cleared, parents collecting their children. Jason stood near the door, holding a small certificate. When he saw Daniel, his face shifted, not angry, but hurt, deeply hurt. "You said you'd come," Jason whispered. Daniel opened his mouth to explain, but the boy shook his head and walked past him toward his mother. That single moment sliced deeper than the termination letter. Grace approached gently. "Rough day?" Daniel swallowed hard. "You could say that." "You're human," she said softly. "But you have to understand, for some of these kids, consistency is everything." Her words weren't harsh, but they struck truth. Daniel felt the weight of it pressing on him. He had tried so hard to do one thing right, to show up where he had failed elsewhere, and even here he faltered. He walked outside again as the rain slowed to a mist. His breath trembled. For a moment, he felt himself slipping back into the darkness he thought he had escaped, the belief that he always ruined everything he touched. But something inside resisted, a faint spark, a memory of his prayer on the porch, a whisper of the small blessings he had begun to taste. What Daniel didn't know was that this breaking point, this near failure, was not the end of the lesson. It was the moment the truth God had been trying to teach him would finally break through. The climax was coming. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. The rain had stopped, but the world outside his window felt hushed, as though holding its breath. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, replaying Jason's disappointed eyes over and over until they carved themselves into his conscience. It wasn't the job loss that broke him. It wasn't the whispers. It was failing a child who had trusted him. Near midnight, unable to bear the weight inside his chest, Daniel stepped outside and walked toward the quiet streets. He didn't have a destination, only a pull, gentle but certain, guiding his feet. The town was still. Streetlights cast soft halos on the pavement, and in the hush of that silent world, something in him finally cracked open. He stopped near the empty playground behind the community center. The swings swayed lightly in the breeze, creaking like distant echoes of laughter earlier that day. Daniel rested his hands on the cold metal fence, his breath visible in the cool air. "God," he whispered, voice trembling. "I don't know why you're letting me walk through all of this. I don't understand, but if there's something you're trying to teach me, please show me. I'm listening now." The prayer wasn't desperate. It was surrendered. And in that still moment, something shifted. Not a voice from the sky, not a miracle sweeping away consequences, but clarity, deep, piercing clarity, settled into his spirit. He remembered the way Jason said, "Most people don't stay." He remembered Grace's words, "For some of these kids, consistency is everything." He remembered Thomas telling him, "Your value isn't in perfection, it's in willingness." And suddenly, Daniel understood. His failure at the office hadn't destroyed him. It had stripped him. It had pulled away the image he clung to, the illusion of control, the pride that whispered he needed to prove himself to matter. What God had been trying to teach him all along was simple, yet profound. Purpose isn't found in success, it's found in service. Transformation isn't born from applause, but from humility. And healing begins the moment a man stops running from the truth and steps into it. Daniel felt tears slip down his face, quiet and unforced. For the first time, he didn't fight them. He looked at the dark building of the community center, its windows reflecting the moonlight. And in that reflection, he saw himself, not as a man ruined by mistakes, but as a man finally ready to learn. He whispered one more prayer, almost a vow. "Father, if you'll guide me, I'll show up, even when it's hard, even when it costs, even when I fail. Help me become who you're calling me to be." And he didn't know it yet. But this night, standing alone in a quiet playground, would become the moment he would look back on for the rest of his life and say, "This was the lesson that changed everything." Redemption was already unfolding. The next morning, Daniel rose before dawn, not because of anxiety this time, but because something within him had shifted. A quiet resolve pulsed beneath his ribs, steady, new, unmistakably from God. The sky was still dim when he walked toward the community center, the cool air brushing against him like a fresh beginning. He expected the doors to be locked, but they weren't. Grace was already inside, setting up materials for the day. When she looked up and saw him, she didn't smile immediately. She waited. Daniel stepped forward, his voice humble and honest. "Grace, I'm sorry I let Jason down yesterday. I should have told you about the meeting. I should have asked for help. I want to do better. If you'll still have me, I'd like to keep serving here." Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded gently. "Showing up today means more than you think." Her words warmed something inside him. Not pride, but gratitude. Pure, simple gratitude that felt like a breath after holding it for far too long. Later that afternoon, when the children arrived, Jason walked in slowly, clutching his backpack. He spotted Daniel across the room. Their eyes met. Jason hesitated, almost turning away, but Daniel knelt down, making himself smaller, lowering himself to the boy's level. "Jason," he said softly, "I'm sorry. I should have been here. I can't change yesterday. But I'm here now, and I'm going to keep showing up. I promise." Jason looked at him, really looked, searching for something only a child's heart could measure. Then, without a word, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Daniel's shoulders. The hug was small, but it held weight, forgiveness, trust renewed, a seed breaking through the soil. And in that moment, Daniel felt the lesson settle deeply within him. God hadn't punished him. He had rebuilt him from the inside out. Throughout the day, Daniel helped students with homework, tied loose shoelaces, listened to small stories that felt bigger than they sounded. He didn't try to impress. He didn't try to fix everything. He simply served, steadily, quietly, willingly. And as he walked home that evening, the sun setting in gentle shades of gold and rose, Daniel lifted his face to the light and whispered a sincere expression of gratitude. "God, thank you. Not for what I lost, but for what you're forming in me. Thank you for not giving up on me when I nearly gave up on myself." The breeze carried his words softly, almost as if offering them back to heaven. He didn't know what awaited him next. New work, new purpose, new direction. But this time he wasn't afraid. He felt grounded, steadied by grace, anchored by truth. Daniel wasn't the same man who had made that harmless decision. He had been humbled, reshaped, and gently remade. Redemption had taken root, and now transformation was beginning to bloom. Weeks passed, and what began as Daniel's quiet attempt to rebuild became something much larger than he ever expected. He continued volunteering at the community center, not out of obligation, but out of a deep, steady conviction. A calling he hadn't seen until life stripped away everything else. Grace soon trusted him with more responsibility. He organized small workshops, helped guide new volunteers, and even started a mentorship group for boys who struggled with confidence, schoolwork, or simply loneliness. Jason, once timid and easily discouraged, now ran into the center each afternoon with newfound energy, always looking for Daniel first. The shift wasn't loud or dramatic, it was quiet, like dawn slowly filling a room. Parents began to notice. Teachers took note. Even Thomas, who visited one afternoon, watched Daniel in silence for a long moment before smiling with quiet pride. "You're different," Thomas said after the children left. "Not someone new, just more whole." Daniel nodded, because he felt it too. One Saturday morning, Grace approached him with a thoughtful look. "The board wants to expand the program," she said. They notice the impact you've made. They'd like you to consider coming on staff. The words hit Daniel with unexpected emotion. Steady work, a second chance, not in accounting, not in the world he once clung to, but here, right in the place where his heart had begun to heal. He closed his eyes for a moment, and a simple whisper rose from his soul, a gentle act of worship. God, whatever you have for me next, I'm yours. When he accepted the offer, it didn't feel like triumph. It felt like alignment, stepping into something God had been preparing long before Daniel recognized his tug. Months later, people in town no longer spoke about his failure. They spoke about his impact, about the kids whose lives were changing, about the gentle, steady man who showed up every day with humility and purpose. Daniel's life didn't return to what it was. It grew into what it was meant to be. And though the lesson that changed him came through loss, he carried it now as a quiet strength, a testimony etched into every life he touched. Sometimes the moments we fear the most, the ones that shake our pride, interrupt our plans and strip away our comfort, are the very places where God plants the beginnings of our transformation. Daniel learned that the breaking wasn't punishment, it was preparation. The loss wasn't the end. It was the clearing of old ground so new purpose could grow, and the same is true for anyone who feels their life has unraveled beyond repair. God doesn't waste pain. He doesn't abandon us in our consequences. He walks with us through them, shaping our hearts, softening what had hardened, and gently guiding us toward the life He always intended. When we finally stop running, when we listen, when we surrender our way for His, that's when clarity comes. That's when peace begins. That's when purpose awakens. Daniel's story reminds us of a simple, unchanging truth. God's lessons don't break us. They build us. Everything had a purpose.